Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're having one of our series of webinars that we've been identifying throughout the year, or do most of the year anyway. And it's one of the things we've been planning and looking forward to. So today we have Sarah, and she's going to be talking about the building international resiliency. And so this is going to be about an hour and a half, so more than what we usually sit on the webinars for. So it'll be an hour and a half, and we'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Anna. I also want to thank Fannie Mae, our sponsor, for hosting this webinar, and just delighted to introduce Sarah Kalistek. See, I practiced that and I still, but Sarah, I've known Sarah for about 10 years. Can you believe that? It's just amazing how fast time goes. And I met Sarah when she was working with NCAI, National Congress of American Indians, when she was there. And then she now afterwards moved and worked with NICWA, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, right? Yes. And so she's been there for about a little over 5 years, but I've known her and I feel so connected with her because we're both social workers. We have been in the field. She has done work on the ground with community at a national level, state level. So she understands the work on the ground and knows and feels what you all are doing when you're doing this work on the ground. She also, just to kind of brag on her a little bit, she's an author on several publications, trainer extraordinaire. You guys will see that. Sits on a couple of boards. So she definitely is a mover and shaker, a humble, graceful woman. And so a warm welcome from the coalition to you, Sarah. I'm going to pass it off to you. So thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna and Vicki. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you this morning. So Chamai, everyone. Hello and good morning in my native Alutiiq language. Again, I'm Sarah Kostelik, and I'm a citizen of the native village of Uzinki, which is a small community of about 250 people near Kodiak, Alaska. And I live in Portland, Oregon now, where I serve as the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. So Vicki, if we can pull up the slides, I'll talk just quickly about our agenda this morning. So as Anna said, we've got about an hour and a half, a little bit less than that now this morning. And so we'll go to our second slide here, and I'll just share with you what I'm hoping we can cover together in this 90 minutes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about culture and worldview. We're going to compare and contrast linear and relational worldviews. We're going to talk about the values that are associated with those different worldviews and the theory of change that accompanies them. We're going to take a couple minutes to do a quick self-assessment, and then we're going to use that relational worldview to create a roadmap for ourselves, to create a plan for intentionally building our resilience. We're going to talk a little about stress and trauma, and then we're going to conclude this morning in some breakout groups. So you'll actually have a chance to spend some time together thinking individually about how you want to build your resilience, and then talking as a small group about what kinds of strategies you want to try to build your resilience. So we have a lot to cover, but I'm going to just invite you to please feel free to jump in anytime with questions. Feel free to put them in the chat box or to take yourself off mute and just ask your questions. So I'll pause several times to invite them, but also definitely feel free to just ask questions throughout. So with that, we'll move to the next slide, please, Vicki. Thank you. So what comes to mind when we think of culture? So I want to talk about the relationship between culture and worldview, where the idea of worldview comes from. So when we use the word culture, we often think of these kinds of things. We think about spirituality and values. We think about ceremonies, about things we can see, about art and music and dance. Language, we often think of language as being the backbone of culture, the thing that holds and supports culture. but also worldview, which I've highlighted here because we're going to talk more about that. But also social activities, affinity groups. We think about family and kinship and marriage and parenting. When we think about culture, we also think about institutions, laws, governance. We think about social rules, about norms, and help-seeking behavior, what the norms are around that, for example. And then finally, things like clothing and shelter and food. So you can see that culture is complex. And also we say everybody has one, and most of us have more than one. So the next slide, please. So we can relate the items on that list to our definition of culture. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about an integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior. The customary beliefs, social norms, and material traits of a group, of a racial, religious, or social group, for example. So worldview then. As we said previously, worldview is just one of the things that makes up culture. And a worldview is a collective or shared thought process of a group of people. So our founder of the National Indian Child Welfare Association is a man named Terry Cross. He's a Seneca man. And when we talk about worldview, Terry likes to joke that worldview is the big idea. And he says that because when we look at worldview, this is how it's composed. Thoughts are organized into ideas. Ideas are organized into concepts. Concepts organized into constructs. Constructs organized into paradigms. And paradigms organized into worldview. So in that sense, worldview is the big idea. Next slide, please. So as you can see, our worldview consolidates our way of knowing. So it consolidates those thoughts, ideas, concepts, constructs, paradigms. The worldview encompasses all of those things. It brings all of those things together. So we're going to spend some time now comparing and contrasting two different kinds of worldviews, a Western European worldview, which is a linear worldview, and a relational worldview. Next slide, please. So again, a worldview is a collective thought process of a group of people. And now we're going to talk about these two specific kinds of worldviews, a linear worldview and a relational worldview. So let's dig in. Great. So in most academic disciplines, including social work, we're trained in the linear worldview that characterizes Western European or American thought. And this is also reflected in the medical model. And Vicki, if you could, there's one more piece to this slide here. Yeah, and so perfect, thank you. So the medical model and Western European American thought, the linear worldview, is organized around a pattern of cause and effect. So we're going to compare this mainstream model with Indigenous worldviews. And in this exercise, it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot of variation along the continuum, certainly, and also important to acknowledge that many Native people have the ability to code switch. So that is to jump back and forth as our circumstances require between a linear worldview and a relational worldview. So this is often what we think about when we say we walk in two worlds. It's our ability to code switch, to jump back and forth between these different ways of looking at the world and to be able to make sense of them and to be effective in both of these ways of being in the world. So next slide, please. So here we see that pattern of cause and effect that we were just talking about. So in the medical model or in social work practice, we see social history as causing the presenting problem, which is the problem that motivates someone to seek help. So we do an assessment, we'd prescribe a treatment, and then we'd expect an outcome from that treatment to address the presenting problem. And so we'd expect that the client's condition would improve. So next slide, please. So the theory of change here in the linear worldview is, given this, if we do this, then this will happen. Next slide, please. But culture matters. Culture shapes our worldview, our behavior, and our communication. So next slide, please. So let's talk about the relational worldview. So the relational worldview finds its roots in tribal cultures. So it is a composite of indigenous teachings. And as you know, there are many teachings about the circle, the sacred hoop, the medicine wheel. So this is really a way of consolidating many of those different beliefs, those different teachings about worldview, about how the world works. So in this relational worldview, balance and harmony in relationships between multiple variables, including spiritual forces, make up the core of this system. So health and wellness are said to exist only when things are in balance. So people thrive, our communities thrive, when the circle is in harmony. Next slide, please. So the relational worldview is intuitive, it's non-time bound, and it's fluid, so it's constantly changing. So in this worldview, the causal factors are considered together, and it's the interdependence of the relationships with all of the factors taken at once that allows for understanding behavior. So in the relational worldview, helpers and healers are taught to understand problems through the balances and imbalances in a person's relational world. So we're taught to see and accept complex and sometimes illogical interrelationships that can be influenced by manipulating the balance contextually, cognitively, emotionally, physically, and or spiritually through those quadrants, through those 4 quadrants. In this worldview, the question of how to restore balance is seen as more important than why something happened. So we're less concerned about why something happened and much more concerned about how to restore the balance. In this worldview, interventions don't need to be logically targeted to a particular symptom or cause, but rather interventions can focus on bringing the person back into balance. So nothing in a person's existence can change without all other things changing as well. So one change in one quadrant has a ripple effect that changes everything else in all of the other quadrants in the circle. So next slide, please. And if you hit the, yeah, perfect. So we're going to get a bunch of examples here around the circle, and we're going to talk about what these 4 quadrants mean, what some examples are of the things in the circle. So the relational worldview can be illustrated with a circle divided into 4 quadrants, and these quadrants represent the 4 major forces or sets of factors that need to be in balance together. So these are the context, the mind, the body, and the spirit. And here are some things that we think of as being in each of these quadrants. So just for the sake of illustration, the mind quadrant includes our cognitive processes. So things like our thoughts and memories and knowledge. It also includes our emotions. So things like feelings and our defenses and self-esteem are all in that mind quadrant. The body quadrant includes physical aspects. So things like our genetic inheritance, our gender, condition, as well as things like sleep and nutrition and substance use or abuse. In the context quadrant, we have culture and community, family, peers, school, work, our social history. And then our spiritual quadrant includes both positive and negative, learned teachings and practices, as well as positive and negative metaphysical or innate forces, so things that are beyond our control. So in the relational worldview, we say that these quadrants are in constant flux and change. We say we're not the same person at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as we are at 7 o'clock in the morning. Our sleep level is different, our nutrition is different, our context is likely to be different. And that means that our behavior is different Our feelings are different, and what we think about will be different. So this system is constantly balancing and rebalancing itself as we change our thoughts, our feelings, our physical state, our spiritual state throughout the day, for example. So this is constantly changing, as we said, constantly in flux. And naturally, as human beings, we tend to intervene to rebalance ourselves. And we do this without even thinking about it. So when we're hungry, we eat, we get a snack. When we're tired, we rest. If we're feeling lonely, we connect with our family or friends. So we have the ability as human beings to impact this. It's not something that passively happens to us. We're not just affected by all of these things, but we have the power to influence all of this, the power to intervene and to restore balance when we're out of balance. So if we're able to stay in balance, then we're said to be healthy. But as you all know, sometimes our balance is temporarily lost. And an elder in my community talks about this state of being out of balance as getting wobbly. So sometimes we get wobbly, sometimes we fall out of balance. But again, we have the capacity as human beings, for the most part, to keep our balance. And actually, our different cultures provide many different mechanisms that assist us in maintaining that balance. So things like spiritual teachings, social skills and norms, dietary rules, family roles, these are all examples of the myriad ways that our culture helps us maintain our balance. And so this graphic, as we've said, gives examples of what might be in each of these quadrants, but these are all just examples, and it's impossible to show everything that fits in all of these quadrants because the circle includes all of life. And so everything in our lives is included in this circle. And again, health and well-being are said to exist when all of the 4 quadrants come into balance. So I'll pause here for a minute and just see if there are any questions about what I shared quickly.
Like vitamins, toothpaste, and first aid kits. Plus, up to $50 for healthy foods each month. All with no extra cost.
I think someone joined us and we could hear background. I don't know if you had a question, if you're unmuting, or that was by accident. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vicki. Okay, so we can move to the next slide then if there aren't any questions. So what I want to talk about now is that each of these contrasting worldviews, each of these different ways of looking at the world, are associated with a set of values. So the linear worldview is associated with values. It values facts and measurement and timelines and individuality. It values compartmentalizing as a way to understand something. That's reducing it to its smallest part, to its core, as a way of understanding something. And it values credentials. Next slide, please. The relational worldview also has a set of values associated with it. And as you can see, many of these values contrast with the linear worldview values. So for example, wisdom is valued over knowledge. So we think about wisdom as being knowledge in context. The notion of things happening in their own time is valued as opposed to rigid timelines with an emphasis on clock time and punctuality. Observation is valued as another scientific method. Generosity is valued over accumulation. Indirect communication is valued. So this is not telling people what to do, but storytelling, telling things indirectly. Oral tradition is valued over writing things down. Cycles and phases are valued over steps and stages. And holistic thinking is valued over breaking things down to their smaller parts. So these differences in values impact how we interact with one another. Next slide, please. So the relational worldview has a theory of change that's different than the theory of change in the linear worldview. So in the linear worldview, we talked about the theory of change that says, if this, given this, then we would expect a certain outcome. That's that cause and effect thinking. But here in the relational worldview, we have a really different kind of theory of change. In fact, here we say that change is inevitable, that it's constant, it's a cyclical part of the human experience, that change occurs in natural, predictable patterns, but it can also be facilitated to produce a desired outcome. When we're out of balance, we don't have to stay out of balance. We don't have to stay stuck where we are. We can't control everything that's going on in our 4 quadrants, but we can control some things. And frequently we do have the ability to regain or restore our balance. And when we regularly assess our balance and when we intentionally adjust the necessary elements of the quadrants to promote better balance, then we can think about that process as building our intentional resilience. So next slide, please. In the relational worldview, the outcomes we're trying to create are balance and harmony. So we can think of balance as equilibrium. So it's the adjustment pattern that has most effectively incorporated the stimuli and response in those 4 quadrants. And harmony is the state of the variables in our 4 quadrants when they're in complementary relationship and together can produce wellness, the capacity for joy, and the ability to thrive. Next slide, please. In relational worldview practice, a change agent, that's you, interacts with the 4 quadrants with purposeful intent to restore balance and to promote harmony. And again, the interventions or the steps that you take to restore your balance don't have to target a specific symptom, but are frequently designed actually to impact multiple quadrants, to impact multiple things. So we're not just trying to find one symptom and then do something to address one symptom. It's not that cause and effect, but it's really an intervention aimed at adjusting balance, which then affects everything else, and all of the other quadrants. So when you attend to this, when you check in with yourself regularly, when you try different things to alter your quadrants and to shift your balance, you can actually cultivate your resilience over time. And you can see changes in your balance and harmony, both immediate and in a sustained way. Next slide, please. So an exercise that we can do to think about this is to take, just a minute or two right now to check in with yourself, to actually think about how you're doing right now, what's happening in each of your quadrants. So Vicki, can we go to the next slide, please? So here is our diagram. And we'd ask you to, again, just take a minute or two and think about each of these 4 quadrants. Think about a variable or a description about how you're doing in each of these 4 quadrants. And if you feel comfortable, feel free to type in the chat box or to take yourself off mute. Just share an aspect or two of how you're doing. So we're, mid-morning on a Wednesday morning, the middle of the week. We're almost in the middle of the month of May. It may be feeling like springtime where you are. And how are you doing this morning?
What was context?
So context are the things outside of us. So it can be our environment, our social history, our peers, our school, our work, all of those things that are external to us. So just check in with yourself and think about how you're doing.
So Joanna has a comment in the chat. Mind overwhelmed, body weary, spirit connected because I returned to church in person. context wobbly.
Yeah, I like that word wobbly.
I do too. I just said wobbly because things are so, whoops, the context that we're in is so uncertain with being in person, remote, and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. I try to find gentle language to talk about things that are sometimes tough for me. I think this is something that that I learned from my elders, but I'm always struck by the gentle language that we can use to acknowledge our current reality, but also to not be too hard on ourselves, to give us some freedom to acknowledge what's going on, but also to be gentle with ourselves.
So Michelle put context overwhelmed, spirit in check.
Oh, okay, good.
And I put down context balanced, mind clear, spirit free, body heavy.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for participating in that exercise with me. And let's go on to the next slide here. And so that exercise that we just did is intended to show that we can shift our balance. So we did our quick self-assessment. And the next thing we could do, for example, would be to pause and to take some deep breaths. We could close our eyes, or we could just breathe deeply in for 4 counts and hold our breath for a second and breathe out for 8 counts. So breathing out more slowly. And if we did that 4 times, even just that very tiny intervention, chances are we would feel some things differently in our body, in our mind, in our spirit. That just taking the opportunity to take some deep breaths is a really simple thing we can do to shift our balance in a small way. So we don't even have to do something big or dramatic, but we have the power to shift our balance and to work towards building resilience. So we know that adversity is a normal part of life, that we always face challenges. Sometimes they're small challenges, sometimes they're big challenges. But the greater the stress, the more intentional we have to be to restore our balance. So it may take something more than those couple of deep breaths to restore our balance when we're facing greater stress. So we have to be more intentional. And something that's really fabulous is that our tribal practices, our cultural practices, are full of intentional strategies to restore our balance. So we can think about some of the things that our cultures may give us to do in all 4 of those quadrants. So we could think about things like smudging, sweat lodges, teas, ceremonies, dances, feasts, celebrations, potlatches or giveaways, and prayer. And if we think about those things, we could place them in the 4 quadrants. And we could also think about how many of those things don't fit in just one quadrant, but really intentionally are touching multiple quadrants. So when we think about things like sweat lodge, certainly that's affecting our context, the things outside of us as we're gathering to do that. It's affecting our body, our mind, our spirit. And the same holds with other things. When we think about smudging or feasts or giveaways, all of those things are impacting multiple quadrants at the same time, which is a really powerful way to restore balance. So all of our cultures, including Native cultures, but all cultures have such kinds of strategies for regaining our balance. So sometimes our lives and the work that we do can be really stressful and even at times traumatic. But the more intentional we can be about building our resilience, the more likely we are to remain balanced. Next slide, please. So I want to talk for a few minutes about stress and trauma because they're not the same thing. So we all experience stress, and here I define stress as a state of mental or emotional strain or tension that comes from a demanding or taxing situation or from facing adversity. And stress can be negative, particularly if it persists over time, or if we don't know how to cope with it in a healthy way. But stress can also be positive, and the strain or the tension that we feel can also motivate us to accomplish something significant, to do something different. It can help to move us out of our comfortable state and cause us to do something differently. So at times, stress can also be positive. Trauma, on the other hand, is a deeply disturbing or distressing experience. It's an emotional shock. And it's important to note, as we'll talk more in a few minutes, that people may have the same experience, but they may or may not experience trauma similarly. So people can live through the same experience, have the same experience together, but their reaction to it, and in particular, whether or not they experience it as trauma, can be different. And then finally, we talk about traumatic stress, the definition here, as being mental and emotional strain that results from severe adverse experiences. So next slide, please. Sometimes stress, that state of strain and tension, can become traumatic over time. So stress can become traumatic, particularly when it's unmitigated or unmanaged. So when there's no relief from it, when it's chronic, oppressive, and dehumanizing. Stress can turn into trauma when it's internalized and when it becomes toxic to relationships, to our health, to our spirit. It can become traumatic when it triggers historic or personal unresolved grief, loss, or trauma. It can also become traumatic when it's collective. So when there's a group or shared experience, for example, our experience of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So understanding trauma can help us as helpers to navigate the stress of helping our community. And it can also give us foundational information to equip us in our helping role. So we're going to talk now about some different kinds of trauma. So there are many different types of trauma that affect Native people's lives and communities. And not all traumas are traumatic. So that may sound like a funny thing to say. Not all traumas are traumatic. And what I mean by that is that you can experience trauma, but not be traumatized by it. So you can have a traumatic experience, but the impact it has on you doesn't necessarily traumatize you. So we're going to talk more about that. But oftentimes when people experience trauma, they do have negative impacts from it. It does impact them by causing them to experience trauma. And these traumas can affect different people differently, like we said. So people may have different symptoms and different responses that can impact their daily functioning and their emotional state. So traumas can affect our body, our mind, our spirit. And this list here that we're going to talk more about is not all inclusive. It doesn't include all traumas, but the symptoms that we're going to talk about are similar. And depending on the severity of the trauma that someone experiences, the intensity of these symptoms could be greater. So remember, if you're working in Indian country, you're working in an environment in which many people have experienced historical trauma, and those traumatic responses may have been handed down generation to generation. And then we're also operating in an environment where there's ongoing losses, and the nature of the work that you're doing to help people who may experience poverty, homelessness, substance abuse, violence. So you also see current trauma in the work that you're doing. So you're witnessing personal trauma in the present. So let's talk about these different kinds of trauma just briefly. So historic trauma is the collective emotional and psychological injury, both over the lifespan and across generations, resulting from the history of genocide of our people. Intergenerational trauma is the psychological transfer of a trauma response across generations, where descendants not only identify with ancestral history and trauma, but emotionally live in both the past and the present. So they identify with ancestral history and trauma, and their identification with that suffering perpetuates trauma in their own life, both as victims in the generational chain of trauma, as well as carriers of that trauma to their offspring. Unresolved grief is grief resulting from the historical trauma of genocide. So grief that has not been expressed, hasn't been acknowledged, hasn't been resolved. And like trauma, it can span generations. Complex trauma. So this is the notion that Native people often experience multiple types of trauma that have become compounded by repeated and chronic exposure to traumatic experiences that then get layered over historical trauma. Personal trauma in the present. So this is also known as victim trauma. But here we're acknowledging that Native people often face repeated traumatic losses of relatives and community members through things like alcohol and drug-related accidents, homicides, suicides, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, the loss of elders through natural causes. But it's that ongoing personal trauma, that individual trauma that's happening in the present. It also includes things like emotional abuse, bullying, separation, loss of children or other loved ones. And then chronic trauma, which is a unique individual experience associated with a traumatic event or enduring conditions, which can involve death or other loss, serious injury, or a threat to well-being. It's often related to the historical trauma and the intergenerational trauma that's accumulated in Native communities through centuries of exposure to racism, warfare, violence, and catastrophic disease. So these are a number of different kinds of trauma, helpful to just think about the differences between them and the similarities among them. And on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about secondary trauma. So secondary traumatic stress, or STS, occurs when someone works directly with traumatized children and families and experiences indirect exposure to the trauma of people that you're working with. So STS is also sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, bystander trauma, or indirect trauma. And it can result from just a single experience, so one case involving trauma, or from the cumulative effect of many traumatic cases over time. And it doesn't just happen to workers in the secondary sense. It's not just something you're observing, but at times as helpers or healers, when we're working with clients, when we're working with families or children, we may also experience traumatic events firsthand. So verbal or physical assault, violent family members, accidents, or other kinds of things, community violence, for example. And so I'm raising this. This is a really heavy topic, obviously, that we're talking about right now. But I'm raising this because it's important for us to be able to acknowledge the trauma in our work, in our communities. It's important for us to be able to identify it and to talk about it. That's part of what allows us to process it and to heal from it, and also to build that intentional resilience. So a lot of the training I do is with social workers, child welfare workers, victim advocates. So often when we're talking about something like STS, we're talking about the sources of that being things like the death of a child or a family member, investigating a challenging child abuse or neglect report, viewing photographs of injuries. So those are often the kinds of things that we're talking about in the context where I'm training. But there are certainly many other situations or conditions that can precipitate STS. So if you think about families that are stuck in the cycle of poverty and homelessness and substance abuse, violence, and in some families, you work with, you may see several generations struggling with these issues simultaneously. So all of these things can certainly be really hard on your heart and your spirit. It can be difficult to get out of your mind when you go home to your own family. It weighs on you, and it may even cause you to wonder if you can go on being a helper in your own community. So the impact of this is real, and it's important to acknowledge it and to be able to talk about it. And this manifests not just individually on the helpers and healers who are doing the work in community. So it's not just our individual experience of this, but STS also can play out in the workplace. So it can play out in an aggregate level in the collective as well. So when workers are negatively affected by cumulative traumatic events through contact with traumatized clients in their workplaces, then it can actually result in workplace trauma. And so this may show up, we may see it in our workplaces as lateral violence against each other, workers acting out or breaking rules, cynicism or attitude problems, anger expressed at people close to us, including other staff that we're working with. Or at times it can look really different. It can look like withdrawal, absenteeism, people who are opting out of things that they used to enjoy. So the impact can be not just on an individual person, but also collectively at the workplace level. So I'll pause here. We're going to shift now. So this is really heavy in the middle of our webinar, but we're going to shift now to talk about healing and preventing trauma. But before we do that, I wonder, Vicki, if there are questions in the chat or anything else that's come up that you want to share.
I just made a comment. So thank you for that. Cause I just what blew me away is and I know about trauma. I know about the different, but the layering is what just really got me. And I just man, this is layered. Yeah. And we wonder, and I think about, that's why I just want to lift all the practitioners here, because you all are on the ground, you are in the community, you are working with the families, and all of us have had some form of trauma, and lifting you all because you all work hard to try to get families to save, to change their lives. Why can't we do this, right? And it's understanding these layers. And so I just wanted to just tell you that's sort of where my head is, and knowing why things sometimes I think in our communities move slow, because there's so much healing and peeling that needs to happen. And it's hard work. Yeah. It's hard work to do that. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I have a question. I'm wondering, I have my own interpretation and things that I see that affect me in terms of secondary trauma, but for the folks, the practitioners on the line, what might be some examples of trauma? You mentioned some of them, like working with families who are, in maybe an overcrowded housing situation that you're trying to help, or a family who's at risk of foreclosure or eviction. Might be another example, but I just wondered, what are other examples that some of the housing practitioners are seeing that are related to secondary trauma?
I could say for a lot of Native communities on the res, there's always a loss in the community, and it impacts it as a community, but a lot of that's related to alcohol or drugs or something like that, but not, like Vicki was saying, it's layers on layers. So when someone loses someone in a family, it's then there's, I guess for us as practitioners, our clients are shifting and managing their money around that. So they put that more in front of, say, paying on a car payment than going to versus paying for a family's funeral or something. And it's not really a brother or sister, our mom, our dad, it's like family. So people are really interconnected to each other and help each other. And so like us as practitioners, we see a lot of people in our communities helping each other whenever there's a loss of family or something like that. But that's just one of them. There's a lot of things that happen within the Native communities that impact it, not just as a family, but as a community.
The other thing that we've seen when working with clients and talking to them about their credit and their bills and what they have, it can be triggering because they're thinking about where they were 5, 6, 7 years ago and the decisions that they were having to make and why they couldn't pay those bills and the position they were in. And so we've had people in our office, in tears because they're thinking about this. And so it is heavy. And, I worry about my staff that are on the front line as far as what to do with all of that, because they're so compassionate and want to help. And so that's another piece of it too, is for my staff is understanding it's in you to be a fixer, but you can't fix this. So we need to figure out how to pull that back and be a good coach, but not get so involved. It's hard. It's really, really hard.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna. Nicole, or Sarah Nicole made a comment in here about it takes 3 generations for trauma to leave families, especially women and our reproductive systems. For example, if you're pregnant, when trauma happens, it affects your child and their children.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, many of you have probably seen some of the studies about adverse childhood experiences that have been around since the late 90s, but talking about the impact of experiences in childhood that have long-term consequences for health disparities and health as adults, even lifespan. And so that's real. We say, at NICWA, we say that we firmly believe that historical trauma and the contemporary ongoing traumas, the kinds of things that Anna described, that's how adverse childhood experiences get perpetuated, because generation after generation of parents who are experiencing those same traumas as children and then going on to have their own children, those are being passed down. But the good news is that this isn't the end of the story, that we know what to do about this, and that in fact, our people and our cultures have a rich legacy of dealing with trauma in a healthy way. And there are lots of things that we can do to take care of ourselves as the helpers, but also even as tools with some of the clients that we work with. So I really appreciate what Anna was saying about the appropriate role for us to play, because the appropriate role isn't to solve all the problems of the people that we're working with. But we can play a role in coaching. We can play a role in empowering. We can play a role in bringing some tools that can help families, that can help someone to deal with this. And so that's what we want to spend the rest of our time talking about, is not just sitting here with the heaviness, with the weight of the trauma that our communities, that our families, that we ourselves are dealing with, but that there's something that we can do about that. So let's move to the next slide, please, Vicki. So the good news is that we can heal trauma and we can prevent trauma-related burnout. So we're going to talk about a couple of things, and then we're going to spend some time towards the end of this session in breakout groups. So a couple of the methods that we like to share with people are mindfulness, our cultural and tribal teachings, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about intentional resilience a little bit more. So in the next slide, I would just share that, at this point, there's a fair amount of research that shows us that mindfulness really does relieve stress that's associated with trauma. And mindfulness is something that you can do alone or in groups. And although many of us may feel like I don't have the time for that, I don't have time to spend 20 minutes a day practicing mindfulness. But even if you can do it for only 2 minutes a day, the 2 minutes that you do it is better than the 20 minutes that you didn't. So we just kind of encourage people to try some different things. Maybe it's mindfulness, maybe it's other things that we're going to talk about, but to give yourself a chance and to see what works for you. Everybody's plan for how they build their intentional resilience is going to be different. Different things work for different people. And giving yourself the opportunity to experiment, to try some things, may be a really helpful way that you end up learning more about yourself and the kinds of things that are helpful to you. So these are just some really simple steps here about mindfulness. There's a lot of great information on the internet. So mindful.org is one of the places that we work with some of our child welfare practitioners, where we're helping people to think about some different mindfulness and meditation practices. And so, kind of a simple process here for starting to learn about mindfulness. Next slide, please. And, oftentimes when I talk about things like mindfulness or meditation with Native communities, people are quick to say, but we don't need to look to the solutions that other people are finding, or we don't need to look to things that only have, lots of evidence to support their effectiveness. But our own tribal teachings, our own cultural teachings, have always been important to our people, have always been the way that we've dealt with adversity or trauma in some form. And so these kinds of things, the loving connections, the humor, the spirituality, the medicines that we use, all of these things can also help us to heal trauma and to prevent trauma-related burnout from staff who are working with families. So next slide, please. And so we're going to spend the last portion of our time together really focused on intentional resilience. So using the relational worldview model that we started out talking about, we can intentionally intervene in our quadrants and can restore balance. We can bring ourselves back into balance. And this can work for us, and it can work with families that we serve, people that we're working with. So we can plan in advance for activities that help us to build a reserve of energy and peace to draw on when we need it. And we can also plan daily activities that help us to restore our balance when things go sideways in the middle of our day. And when we do both of these things, when we're planning for that reserve and when we have our daily practices that we're using, we can incrementally build our resilience over time. We are actually able to experience trauma and to not be traumatized by it. Or we're able to experience the trauma and then to do the things that we need to do to heal from it in a healthy way. So we say it's just like building muscle. It's a practice, it's an exercise. You do it over and over, and your capacity to find and to restore your balance actually grows. So we always remind the child welfare workers that we work with that, remember the advice that they tell you on an airplane, right? So when the flight attendants are giving you all your safety instructions, one of the things they always tell us is to put on your own mask before you help the people around you. And so as the helpers and healers in your community, doing this work with families, it's really important for you to have your plan for how you're building resilience, for how you're building that reserve, for how you're paying attention to those daily practices that help you to stay in balance. Because our ability to be resilient is what allows us to continue to serve our community. And in order to do that, we have to plan for our intentional resilience. We have to build that resilience so that we can continue to be of service to our communities. So I'm going to pause here. We're going to break into small groups soon, but just wanted to give some time if there are other thoughts, anything else that people would like to share or questions before we spend a little bit of time in some groups. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay. So then we're going to go into the interactive portion of our session then. So we're going to be in some small groups, and we're going to put a handout for you in the chat box. I think maybe we also emailed it out to you, but there's a little worksheet you can use just with the relational worldview and those 4 quadrants. Or you can just draw it on a piece of paper you have. That's an easy way to do it too. But we're going to spend about 15 minutes in our groups. So we're going to ask you to spend 5 minutes alone, just thinking about that relational worldview, thinking about those quadrants, and an item or two, an action or two in each of the quadrants that might be helpful to you in building your intentional resilience. What are the things that you know that help to feed you, or that help to restore you? So think about a couple of things in each of the 4 quadrants. And then after about 5 minutes, just jotting some things down individually, then you can have some conversation in your group. So you can talk a little bit about either what are the elements of your plan. So if you feel comfortable to share about that, you can talk about what it is that you're interested in trying. What kinds of daily practices, what kind of bigger activities that help you to build a reserve, and then just what stood out to you. How does this tool feel? Do you think it's something that's useful to you? Could it be useful to some of the families that you work with? So we'll just take a little bit of time, about 10 minutes after that, for group conversation, and then we'll come back together at about 20 after the hour to talk together as a larger group before we end at 11:30.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm putting us into 2 groups, and thank you, Joanna, for putting the handout in the chat box. Everybody, if you can just download the chat box, the handout's in there twice, so just download that directly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. We'll see you guys shortly. I'll give you a notice in the broadcast. Sarah, how long do you want me to set the timer?
So let's come back together at 20 minutes after the hour.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
All right.
How are you feeling about things, Vicki?
Good. This is like, it's too short. I feel like, you know, there are several moments throughout. Oh, let me pause this.
We're back.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was still waiting to see if there were more coming. Thank you, Joanna. Great. Well, thank you all for sticking with us. I know being on Zoom for 90 minutes at a time is really tough. That's a long stretch. So thank you for sticking in there with us. But we've got about 10 minutes left before we close, and just wanted to create some space to share anything you wanted to about your small group conversation. So as you spent a little bit of time individually thinking about how might this relate to you, how might it be helpful to you, What does it look like to share something like this with families that you work with? Just want to open it up for anything that people want to talk about here in our last couple minutes together.
Well, I'll go. Okay.
No, Anna, go. Anna, go.
I was just gonna say, this was really cool or good thing for that you did with us, because it not only helps us or me personally, but just something to, like Anna had mentioned before, like where we can't fix everything. We don't go into that counseling, like deep counseling services. So just kind of a tool to pass off to them to kind of look into for themselves. So we're already doing it as Native people. And in my group, I'm glad I was with Michelle and Kim, because I always look up to people that are older than me, and I learn a lot. And I learned a lot today. But just this helped me rebalance and get understand where I need to be. I'm expecting a baby in September, so I'm really like overwhelmed and everything. So it's helping me get back on track to what I need to do, prepare myself mentally, emotionally, and physically.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, and I was just going to share that what seems like such a simple tool, like a really simple tool, can be used in so many ways. And we used it just amongst our own conversation in our group, and it was relevant for, we had 2 Native people, 2 non-Native people, but it was still relevant for everyone. And it also spurred a lot of great supportive discussion amongst us. Anna is a good she and Nicole had great suggestions. So I mean, it was a great tool to spur really supportive, like individual thoughts, but also supportive discussion amongst peers. But I could also see, as Anna said, using that tool with your families, like sharing it with your families and clients to help them kind of self regulate or like identify their own actions for healing.
In our child welfare practice with social workers, we teach social workers how to use this with families, and not to use it to assess families or create a case plan for families, but to invite families in. And even kids can participate in this conversation when you're looking around those quadrants and saying, you know, how's everybody doing? How's our family doing together? How are we functioning? How's our spirit? How's our body? So you can think about it at that level too. But we've seen, that workers can use it in their practice with families just as much as they can use it for themselves. And this point about, choosing to share it with somebody, our staff at NICWA had a retreat in February 2020, just before the pandemic hit, where we were doing this work together. We were actually developing intentional resilience plans about 3 weeks before the pandemic hit. And this has become a real touch point for our staff. So regularly people ask each other, how are you doing on your intentional resilience plan? What are you trying now? I'm struggling in the body quadrant. What's worked for you in that quadrant? Or I'm struggling in the spirit quadrant. How about, and smaller groups of our staff will meet up for coffee breaks on Zoom, or, people who are working on something similar, or teams, our development team, our fundraising team, as part of their regular team meeting, checks in at the beginning talking about the resilience plan. So it's been really helpful for us to just share with one another, maybe not everything, some of it's personal, but a thing or two that we're working on, because that builds in that accountability and support. And so it's a way to check in with one another and even ask each other, how are you doing on your plan? Is there anything I can do to support you? So it's been helpful for us.
I love that, Sarah. I love how it's very practical, right? And so it's not very high, very theory based. It's very practical to use internally with your own teams, with your families, like your own personal family too. Like I really want to use that with my guys. Like, how are you in this area? Versus just generally like, how are you doing? It's the usual, I'm good. right? But I think it's also a powerful tool to use with clients, and without them really knowing the context of what you're, as practitioners are giving them, just checking in.
Yeah.
So I love that.
Yeah, and I actually, what you said about families, I think is important, because in our group, Deanna was in our group. She's new to the Seven Sisters team, and she's a new mom. And take it from the wisdom of a new mother. She's talked about, like, in the spiritual quadrant, she's praying with her newborn, and it was a huge reminder that, one way, like for me personally, as well as for the families that we work with, to be able to pass along those coping mechanisms to our kids, and to start framing things in that context, so that they can learn at an early age those the resiliency, planning and thinking mindset.
Yeah.
And I also love, Nicole had to get off, but Nicole from the South Dakota Housing Development Authority, she also she's an advocate for mental health. She used to work in the mental health field, and she just said, well, I go to counseling once a month. And she just shared, like, I go to counseling once a month, and I'm a big proponent of mental health. And it's like, yeah, of course, that's like a huge part of this.
Yeah.
So I appreciated her sharing that.
Yeah. We're almost at the end of our time together. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share? I have one more slide after this, but anything else? Seeing some heads shaking. Okay. Vicki, can we go back?
I guess I wanted to say one quick thing. I guess, and this is what I had mentioned in our breakout, was the thing that's popping in my head throughout this entire thing is our boundaries. Knowing what our own personal boundaries are and when to say when. It's really, because we're all such helpers and caregivers, it's hard for us to say no, but we need to be able to understand our own capacity to be able to do what we can for our community members and our people, our staff, but also to take care of ourselves. So knowing when to say when.
Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate that, Anna. One of the ways that I tend to think about that question of boundaries and how much can I do is also about time horizons. So just saying no now doesn't mean it's no forever, just because I don't have the ability to do it now, or it's beyond what I can handle right now, doesn't mean I can't ever do it, but it's just not going to work right now. So thinking about time horizons makes it easier for me to say, not right now. Great. So as we close here, I just wanted to leave you with this. So I shared with you before a list of our tribal teachings and practices. And so this is a similar kind of list. This is just a little bit more expansive, but these are some of the things that we talk about having the ability to cultivate or to feed to build our resilience. So these are some really concrete ideas about things that can influence our quadrants, both in the short and long term, that may help us to come back into balance. And so one of the things on this list that people often point out to me is tears. And people say, how do tears help you build resilience? And I had a really wonderful conversation with someone recently about the importance of making time to cry, the importance of having a scheduled time to just be able to release what's going on. And if that's through tears, or if that's through running, or if that's through a hot shower, or whatever way you release, but building in that time for release, because that really is so necessary in the work that we're doing. So just wanted to leave you with these other ingredients for building resilience. So hope and laughter and service, tears and stories, the gift of having meaningful work to do. Not everybody has the opportunity to do meaningful work, and we have that opportunity to do meaningful work, and the importance of love in the work that we do. So just wanted to leave you with this list, and thank you for the time that you spent with me. In my language, we say koyana. And just want to encourage you. This has been kind of a heavy time together. And so as you get off the Zoom meeting and think about the next thing you have to do, would just encourage you to take some deep breaths, to release whatever is sitting with you. If you can, to step outside for a few quick minutes to feel the sunshine or the rain on your face, but to give yourself a pause for transition as you get ready to go into the next thing that's on your calendar today. So thank you for your time. Koyanan.
Sarah, greatly appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. Anna, I'll pass off to you to just give closing remarks to the folks that are here.
Thank you guys all for joining. I hope you all enjoyed it. I certainly did. And the end of the meeting or the webinar is always the biggest takeaway. You start off tired, then you're like, I'm energized and motivated. So thank you guys all for joining. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Everyone, please fill out the evaluation. 4 questions, pretty easy. So I appreciate that. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good to be
Vicki,
with you all.
Vicki, where's the evaluation?